My name is Geoff Solarsh, and on behalf of the organising committee of the South African Film Festival in Australia and New Zealand, I want to welcome our viewers to this conversation with our two very special guests, Sylvia Vollenhoven, the director of the wonderful Jozi Gold, and Mariette Liefferink, the extraordinary figure at the center of this real-life drama. And it really is a real-life drama. Sylvia, as some of you may know, is an award-winning writer, journalist, filmmaker, and playwright, I believe, with a long track record of producing cutting-edge and penetrating documentaries on the South African scene. I think that the film itself gives us a very, very adequate introduction already to Mariette. But I think it is worth mentioning that as a consequence of her environmental activism, she now heads her own NGO, the Federation for a Sustainable Environment, and sits on many national boards and committees concerned with the environmental impacts of mining in South Africa, and many other related issues from what I can see. So it really is a great pleasure to be with both of you. And as I think I've said to you already, I am a great admirer of this movie. So it makes it a particularly pleasant task to be able to talk with both of you about what I really think is a beautiful and sensitive contribution to an understanding of this really very big problem in South Africa. So look, just to get the conversation going, I thought I might just ask you, if you don't mind, to say a little about your first meeting. I'm fascinated to know what happened when the two of you first met each other. And also, if I may ask, what your first impressions were of each other. So over to you. Maybe we'll start off with Sylvia.
Okay, and just to say that, you know, Mariette is celebrating her birthday in a very small seaside town, so her Wi-Fi connection isn't good enough for video, but we will be able to hear her. I'm going to give my side of it very, very quickly. My co-director, Frederick Garreton, is a very, very old friend, very close friend of long standing. We've done amazing things together as friends and as journalists over the years. And he's, of course, based in Sweden and I'm in South Africa. So somebody approached him with this film and asked him to come on board. And his first response was he would only take on board this project if I was the South African producer alongside him. And then he sent Adam Wells to me, who is the original writer of the story and journalist. And Adam took me, we traveled to Johannesburg together and introduced me to Mariette. I must say, initially I had great reservations about working with, I had not known Mariette before, I didn't know her work, and I had great reservations about working with a white Afrikaner woman telling such a sensitive story. And I kind of had a resistance against the fact that she might be telling us what to do. And I kind of had enough of that. And coming from a very active political background, I was anticipating a little bit of tension. But the moment I met Mariette, I was delighted. And, you know, one of the things as South Africans that help us greatly is that both of us, our first language is Afrikaans. And so the moment you speak in your mother tongue to somebody else, a lot of tensions just melt away and a lot of barriers just disappear. And when I got to know her just beyond her work and beyond her activism, and got to know her personally very quickly, I realized that she has so much integrity and she is warm and open and extremely generous. And so for me, with all of my nervousness and reservations in her house in Johannesburg, it was just so easy to be welcoming and to work with her because she was so welcoming.
That's beautiful, thank you. And Mariette, perhaps over to you. What was Mariette, as Sylvia has mentioned, is off screen, but I think we can hear her very clearly. Mariette, what was your first impression at this meeting?
Well, I felt very flattered. I felt that I'm just an ordinary person, and I had been with Adam I think for years he had been filming when I did my workshops, when I did my tours, when I did interviews with government officials, and well, nothing really developed from there. So I was a little bit, I think, doubtful that anything would come from that. So, of course, when eventually there was the film in the making, I can't tell you how very flattered I felt. I felt it was undeserved, but at the same time, I also felt that it would now give me a public voice to the world, so that the world would be able to witness not only the damage to the environment, but also the human rights violations as a result of mining, because mining, as we know, often has profound and irreversible impacts on the environment, but it also impacts upon the constitutional right of communities, often characterized by widespread poverty, and the rights that are being infringed upon if there is irresponsible mining is, of course, the right to an environment that is not harmful to health and well-being, the right to life, the right to sufficient water of sufficient quality and quantity. So I think the greatness of the objective of the movie, that to me was very important. And it really did bring quite a number of changes. I may just mention that in the movie there is often reference made to radioactivity, because our gold ore co-occurs with uranium. And for many years, the National Nuclear Regulator has considered it to be not within their mandate to address the radioactive mine residue areas. About 400,000 people live within these mine residue areas. And I've just last week been informed that they have established a specific unit within the National Nuclear Regulator to now address these abandoned sites that are radioactive. And I think that was quite an achievement. Most of the residents in the Tudor Shaft informal settlement had been relocated. There had been a significant attention paid to acid mine drainage, which also co-occurs with your gold mining. So there had been many, I think after the screening of the film, many positive changes within government and also within the mining industry.
That's fantastic. You have actually answered one of the questions that I was intending to ask. So it really is wonderful and heartwarming to hear that those effects are already being felt. Every review I've read about this movie makes special mention of this dramatic opening scene, where the first view that we have of Mariette is of a pair of red high-heeled shoes walking across a yellow, dusty mine. Sylvia, I thought it was a moment of pure genius myself, and I just wanted to ask you, if you could say something, perhaps as a filmmaker, about the importance of opening scenes in general. And then I want you specifically perhaps just to say a little about what effect you wanted to create with this opening scene.
As a team, we had lots of discussions about that, of course, but we realized that one of the biggest draw cards of this film is going to be Mariette's personality and her image and her brand, in a way. And because the environmental activism is so dominated by a very specific kind of person, we decided that it was going to make a huge impact because Mariette goes against the grain. You don't see her coming, and she is not stereotypical. She doesn't dress or talk or walk like an activist. She is her own person, and she is aesthetically appealing, very beautiful, wonderful to look at. And so we thought we need to, from the opening moment, we need to use the fact that she is such an unusual character and looks so unusual in the environmental activism world, and use that very effectively to pull audiences in, because when they see a blurb about a film about environmental degradation and the impacts of mining. They're expecting green activists who are rather serious, most of them, and who dress in a certain way. And then comes this contrary character. And we decided that to get that message across, we need to use that contrariness to maximum effect. And we were very blessed in the fact that we have an excellent editor on the film, Stefan Sundloff, who is based in Norway. The film is a co-production between South Africa, Norway, and Sweden. And Stefan, you know, helped us to realize that vision of making maximum use of Mariette's very unusual style of activism.
You know, that really does lead me to another question that I had, and it's a beautiful segue, actually. So that is really very striking, how there is a complete reimagining of what an eco-warrior might look like in this movie, and of course a surprise. There is this big element of surprise. And as you point out, it becomes very evident. The longer I stayed with that movie, the more evident it became just how unique Mariette's presence, persona, and style really was. And I suppose this is a question for you, Mariette. Are you aware of this kind of persona and image that we almost automatically kind of identify in you? And if so, how has that affected, either positively, and I think mainly positively, your own work in the environmental arena? I don't know if you could say something about that.
Because it is me. I can't pretend to be not myself. So I was not aware that I was unusual. However, when I now visit the film again, I do feel a bit embarrassed, perhaps sometimes very embarrassed, because of my ornate clothes or the Chinese dresses and the earrings, big earrings. I must just tell you, Adam Wells's father is also an investigative journalist, and he publishes a magazine, an investigative magazine called Noseweek. His name is Martin Wells. And the first time I became aware that I was viewed as perhaps different or eccentric was on the front cover of this Noseweek a magazine. They pictured me as a Wonder Woman flying through the air, but with this plait of hair and this big earrings and this red lipstick. And then I thought, but perhaps I am a bit offensive to some people. So I think lately I've toned down a bit because I'm also now older, but I so wish sometimes that my accent was not so Afrikaans. I also wish to be younger, but because we are addressing very unpalatable issues, issues about polluted water, contaminated soil, the dust fallout. These are very unpalatable issues, and sometimes my activism to some people, especially the mining companies, may also be unpalatable. And I just felt that if I always dress smartly or try to dress smartly, that perhaps that would be an offset from the unpalatable messages that I am conveying to mining companies.
I often thought actually that, and I wondered whether that didn't actually give you special access in some ways, but you know, that was just a random thought that I had, and I thought that there were some really real advantages in that persona actually, which is your natural persona. Did you want to say something, Sylvia?
I just wanted to add, you know, Geoff, what is important is within the South African context, you have to see that for a very long time as a society, people were boxed artificially in such narrow confines, and you couldn't, it was really difficult to break out of your little area, out of your little box, out of your racial tag, out of the stereotype. And so this makes what Mariette is doing even more important and even more impressive and effective. And I think when it comes to the mining bosses, we went with her to so many different, heads of mining in South Africa to do interviews. And it was very clear when I watched the interaction between Mariette and these powerful people in powerful positions, that in the beginning, they don't see her coming and they might not take her very seriously, but by God, further down the line, they realize that this is a force of nature they have to deal with.
Well, that brings me to another segment, actually, which I particularly loved. And that was the segment in the documentary where you meet with Nick Holland from Goldfields. And after a little kind of strange interlude about pens, the conversation moves from the responsibilities of the mining companies to his advice to invest in gold. I thought this was an enormously telling and unflattering moment, actually. And I wondered, this is really a question to Mariette to begin with. I wondered, Mariette, how you felt about this conversation at the time. I know how I think I would have felt, but I wondered how you felt. And then, of course, maybe you can say, Sylvia, why you thought it was an important piece to include. I loved it.
Yeah, what I can just mention that there often is the debate between economic benefit and also ecological sustainability. So as an activist, I focus on the ecological sustainability because we feel, and I strongly feel, that the elements in sustainable development, namely the environment, the social issues, and the economical issues, that these are not really equal elements. They are more like hierarchical. In other words, you cannot have any sustainable development, economic activity on a deteriorating environmental base. You can also not have any society if the environment has been polluted or if there is degradation. So I think with a mining company, Mr. Nick Holland was, of course, an accountant before he became the CEO of Goldfields. So for him, the economic element was perhaps more important. And I don't think that he realized that the comment he made was perhaps inappropriate for the interview. But I must just tell you, we are enjoying, before he is no longer the CEO, he has retired, but during his time in Goldfields, our relationship developed from a very acrimonious relationship, very a controversial relationship, to a more cooperating relationship. And I may just mention that I was asked by the Northwest University and Van Skyke Publishers to write a chapter for an academic publication dealing with community engagements. And I've used the experience I gained with Goldfields from transitioning from a very, very oppositional activism towards a more cooperating activism. And I must just tell you, it has produced very positive results. In the past, there had been many threats and, in fact, protest action by the communities. But with this journey that I've embarked on with Goldfields, the communities now are much more less, militant, and more also in support of the programs, the social programs of Goldfields. So even though sometimes there are perhaps conflicts of what we believe are goals or of interests, in time we can work through these and transition these conflicts into cooperation.
Beautiful. And that actually comes across very, very often in this film, is your particularly non-aggressive and really non-aversive approach to your conversations, and something that you talk about repeatedly. So it's wonderful to hear that it's bearing fruit. So, just back to you, Sylvia, about the segment. Did you have any special thoughts about it?
The scene with Nick Holland and the luxury pens is one of my favorites in the film, because it is a light moment, and with such a serious issue, you're always looking for light moments to give you a balance in the storytelling. But it's a telling light moment, you know. It's not just funny, it's a little bit biting and cutting, and gives you a short, sharp insight into the character that you're interviewing. Another thing that I'd like to mention is that both Frederick and I are very, very senior journalists, you know, with many years experience. And we discussed whether we should do those interviews or whether Mariette should do those interviews. And we were so happy that we made that decision, because we would have had the calm, cool, professional approach. Mariette has a totally different approach, and it helped us to bring out those characters much more than if we had, they would have seen us coming as journalists. They're used to our kind of approach, even really excellent journalist interviewers. But with Mariette, they never quite knew where they were, but they also felt safe and comfortable. And that is what underpins their activism and makes it so effective, is that as she just said now, you cannot always achieve things with head-on-head aggression, you know. Sometimes you have to go the other way, and sometimes it has to be very diplomatic. And her style of diplomacy with that really firm hand is something to watch.
So the other thing I wanted to ask Mariette was, it's clear from my reading around some of the work that you've done that you've actually been on this quest since 2007. So that's, you know, it might even be earlier than that, but that's the first date that I could come across. So I wanted to ask you, Mariette, when you say a little bit about your transition from a member of Jehovah's Witnesses to this form of activism. But what I wondered was why or how you got involved in this particular issue. What led you into this whole issue with the mining industry?
Yes, I can answer that. My first encounter with environmentalism was in 1995 because Shell, a multinational oil company, Royal Dutch Shell, wanted to build 2 highway petrol stations opposite my home in Bryanston. And so it was basically narrow self-interest that I opposed the development. I won't go into the full story, but there were some bribes offered, and eventually I was the only person opposing the petrol stations. We call it objectors fatigue. So many of the community members became fatigued, tired to oppose. So Shell then offered me a bribe. The bribe not in a monetary form, but to build a terraced garden opposite my home, a swimming pool, an enclosed swimming pool, a tennis court, and so forth. And then I mentioned to them that was bribery. It was in non-compliance with Section 31 of our National Environmental Management Act, and that I will have to report them. Then there was some silence, and then I was asked to speak at the World Summit for the Sustainable Development, the preamble, and I was using Shell as a case study. And that night before my presentation, they approached me and they then said that they've decided they won't pursue this highway petrol station. They will sell the 23 properties, very big properties that they've purchased, and that they are sensitive to the needs and the desires of the community. And they did keep their promise. I still delivered my paper, but they did keep their promise. And then the news media had quite an interest in this old woman standing up against a multinational oil company. And, you know, that, gave me a sense of grandiosity. I felt very important. And I think that is when I realized that one person can make a difference. An ordinary person can make a difference. What is needed just is integrity. What is needed is commitment, perseverance. I'm a marathon runner. I'm not a sprinter. So I think the fact that one perseveres and endures, that is what brings success eventually. And as a result then of the news media coverage, the 53 landowners of West Driefontein. West Driefontein produced, well, it was the richest gold and uranium mine in the world. And it was at that time, the mining company that mined the land was Gold Fields. And the 53 landowners could no longer farm their land because all their fountains dried up. There was tailing storage facilities on their land. And they approached me and asked me to assist them. And that is when I became aware of the devastating consequences of gold mining, of the 270 tailing storage facilities, the 600,000 tons of uranium, the 6 billion tons of iron pyrite tailings and acid mine drainage. So that was how my journey started.
Very interesting. Look, we're probably going to, I could carry on indefinitely with this conversation, but we're probably going to have to call it to an end quite soon. I just wanted to ask Sylvia one other thing, and that is, you know, I'm very aware that I'm assuming that your target audience here was not just a local South African audience, but also an international audience. And I just wondered how, as someone who has lived in South Africa myself and worked with communities in South Africa, I was wondering how you felt you were able to reflect and portray the nuances of South Africa as part of this particular movie, and in movies in general, documentaries in general that you've made. How difficult is that to do, or am I overstating the difficulty?
No, obviously with every movie, and especially a movie of this nature, there are lots of difficulties. One of our biggest difficulties with this film was the fact that there is so much research, especially that Mariette has done, piles and piles of it. And there is so much information, extremely serious factual information. How to take all of that information, condense it into 70 minutes or so, and make it digestible, understandable, and keep the audience. That was really important for us. And in our discussions, one of the things that we revisited a lot in the planning and the development and the making of the film is our own personal motivation. The fact is that so many countries are affected by mining. It's not just South Africa. And then I realized that when I first came to live in Johannesburg, I was a young student coming to journalism school at the Star, and I just took those huge mountains for granted. It was just there on part of the landscape. And then later on, when I returned to another spell of living in South Africa, I lived with an aunt who had a creche that was a kindergarten that was really beneath one of these biggest mine dumps. And she used to come and tell me about how the children always had breathing problems and skin problems. And this was in the 80s. And she was convinced that it was the dust, because it's worse in the windy season. And I remember putting it in the back of my mind and thinking, one day I'll do a story about this. But, then came the 90s and South Africa's freedom and democracy, and all of those things paled into the background. But I always felt guilty about it. And eventually my aunt died of cancer. And when I started working on this film and connecting the dots, I realized, like so many South Africans, we have been living with this huge problem in plain sight and just accepting it.
I'm very reluctantly going to have to bring this conversation to a close. I just really want to say what an absolute pleasure it has been to speak with both of you. It's a beautiful film. It's a really beautiful film, and I feel very lucky to have had a chance to spend as much time as I have with it, and also to speak with both of you. So I want to just thank you on behalf of the organisers of the South African Film Festival here in Australia and New Zealand for being part of it with us, and I think people will love hearing from you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And for people who want to continue the conversation, please join our conversation on our Facebook page at Jozi Gold.